Hello everyone, let us start discussing the second question on polity. So the question goes as this: while Indian constitution strikes a middle path between parliamentary sovereignty of the British system and judicial supremacy of the American system, the fine balance seems to have altered in recent decades. Do you agree? So I think you are getting the question really right. We know that India has gone for a balance between parliamentary sovereignty and judicial supremacy. So it's a fine balance, right? So in Britain, we have the idea of parliamentary sovereignty, and we know what it looks like. And in America, we have the doctrine of judicial supremacy. So we know how both these looks like. But we wanted the best of both these worlds, so we tried to balance. We had tried to have a middle path that would balance both these principles, so that we can enjoy the benefits of both judicial supremacy and parliamentary sovereignty, and which we call as constitutional supremacy. So that has been the scenario. But this balance of judiciary vis-a-vis parliament that we or our constitution makers had tried to entrench in our system has altered in the recent decades. So that is the question. So you have to have a reference to the fundamental constitutional principle of that balance. Then you have to do an analysis based on the contemporary events. Okay, then you could say, do you agree? So do you agree means mostly the question would be, people would say, okay, I agree, yes, I agree, or no, I agree, no, I don't agree. So I would say those are perfectly rational responses, and that is perfectly fine. But I would say in most of the cases, it's not up to that whether you agree or you don't agree. I would say you have to give points to prove both sides. Okay, you could say that I agree as far as these aspects are concerned, but I do not agree as far as some other aspects are concerned. Okay, you could go in that structure. So I think that is about the understanding the question. Now let us see how we can structure the question. Okay. Okay, you could say the context of why we achieve, why we look for that balance between parliamentary sovereignty and judicial supremacy, or you could say what it means in an Indian context. What does the balance between parliament and judiciary means in an Indian context? And you could also mention the times from which this balance has been affected, or you could say, like, what is your take on it? Okay, so as far as I am concerned, I think that balance has been affected for different reasons, or if you are not agreeing with that, you could go otherwise also. There is no perfect compulsion on taking any sides, but overall it's better to take a middle path. Okay, so that would be the introduction, the context, in context of this balance, what is the current scenario. So when in UPSC, when you are what do you mean by current scenario? It's really interesting. It's not current at all. So if they are talking about some constitutional principles, there is always some evolution happening to the idea, no? So when they are asking a current scenario or recently, you have to think about 20, 30 years, okay? So it depends on the subject. For normally polity, the current scenario, recent scenario is 20, 30 years. So you can look at the entire evolution and make a comment, okay? Then you go to the body paragraphs. So what is the thing that you can mention there? So you could say, what has happened to this balance? What has happened? Or you could say how that balance has shifted, how the balance shifted. And you could mention the implications of this shift, because that is something that is crucial to us, right? Implications of the shift in this balance, okay, to the Indian democratic system. So we are saying that we wanted a crucial balance between parliamentary sovereignty and judicial supremacy, and if we are establishing that that balance has shifted, then it is a clear-cut case that something bad has happened in the Indian constitutional scenario. That is the implication. These implications, I mean, most of them would be negative implications. Now it is up to correct this imbalance, right? So how to correct this imbalance? How to correct the imbalance? So I would say write this as part of the body itself. So if there is a serious limitation of shortage, you can write this and conclude. But ideal scenario, I would want you to write another conclusion also there. That would be how correcting the imbalance uh, improve our political system. Okay, so overall, what is the benefit that we are going to accrue by once we correct this imbalance? So I think these are all the elements that should go into your answer. So here, what has happened or how that balance shifted, these are both the same question. I just put it in two different ways. Then the implication, how? So here you could have three. See, okay, you have three set of points you have tried. Here you could have one or two, and final conclusion. Okay, so I think that is a structure you should be taking in this question. Now let us go to the actual content. So let us look the crucial content of the answer. So the introduction. So what should be going in the introduction? So I would say you can you could start by saying the reason why we try to achieve this balance. I think that's the best way to put this forward, and that's a political or that's a philosophical way to look that thing. So how could you start the introduction? So I would say that Indian constitution makers wanted to create a system that is responsive to the needs of the public, but that should be within a larger moral and political ideal. Okay, are you getting that? So it's a difficult to understand idea. So we have conceived a larger political ideal for us, but within that ideal, we want the needs of the public to be fulfilled. Okay, it's not that whatever the public wants would be given by the government, because the public could at any time degrade into a mobocracy, right? Like in the days of the Rome and the Colosseum and stuff like that. So that could always happen in a democracy. But so we don't want democracy to erode itself into a state of mobocracy or majoritarianism. But we want absolute responsiveness to the needs of the public, but the ends which the public should be looking at, or the ends of the state or the ends of the country as a whole, should be some larger political ideal. So how can we help achieve both of this? Okay, the parliament, the supremacy given to parliament or sovereignty given to parliament would make sure that the needs of the public are dealt with then and there. Okay, you can have a government that is responsive to the needs of the public. That is one thing. Then why do you need an overarching idea of judicial review onto this thing? Because the judiciary is constituted by experts, the experts in political philosophy, experts in constitutionalism and things like that. So they can always interpret the activities of the parliament, which stems from the demand of the public. They can always interpret whether this is in line with a larger political or moral ideal. If it's not, they can render it unconstitutional. So I'm just giving you a context rather than jumping into the answer. So this is the kind of reason why we try to bring in both this together. Okay, we need a parliament. We need to give supremacy to parliament so that public's, the people's will is being represented or being acted upon by the government. But we brought in an expert judiciary to interpret the activities of legislature and executive so that it never goes unconstitutional, right? So that is the context, or that was the larger thought that loomed in the minds of constitutional assembly makers when we tried to bring in a balance between parliamentary sovereignty and judicial supremacy. Okay, so you could start by saying that Indian constitution or Indian constitutional makers tried to bring what is known as constitutional supremacy. So this term has to be there in the introduction itself. Constitutional supremacy means neither parliament nor judiciary is supreme, but constitution is the ultimate supreme thing. So this is the moral ideal I was mentioning before. So the Indian state at the time of independence has been granted a moral political ideal towards which the legislature, executive and judiciary should work for. Okay, but within this larger moral ideal, the next biggest concern for us is that the government has to be responsive to the needs of the public. So you could say that, so first you have to mention about constitutional supremacy, then you could say that we wanted a state that would be responsive to the needs of the people. Okay, needs of the people. So thus we have a system of parliamentary democracy. Okay, so we have a state that is responsive to the needs of the people. But we also wanted uh, this need of the people to be located within a larger political ideal of the constitution. Hence, we want, so these needs should be within a political or moral ideal which the judiciary will help to enforce. See, I know this is going really abstract and tough, but I think this is something I came up with these ideas. I just wanted to put these ideas together like this. To be precise, I don't know whether this had been in the minds of Indian constitution makers, but I think this goes for a pretty solid case as to what their concerns would be. So I think if you paint this picture, okay, so overall constitutional supremacy is something we went by. Okay, that is something we all know. So once we know what we went by, you could easily deduce why how we reached there, right? So this is my reasonably strong guess as to why they did that. Okay, we wanted a larger moral and political ideal, and within that we wanted the state to be fully responsive to the needs of the public. So it's not public that is the ultimate, but the constitution that is the ultimate in this country. So that is why we have a balance between parliamentary sovereignty and judicial supremacy. Okay, and then you could say right since the Keshavananda Bharati, you could straight away say that right since Keshavananda Bharati, this balance has taken a severe hit, with very often this balance tilting in favor of judiciary. Okay, then you can go into the core of the answer. Then you can move to the body paragraph. So here what exists is that so many checks and balances has been built into the Indian constitutional mechanism so as to maintain this delicate balance between parliamentary sovereignty and judicial supremacy. So you could mention the articles like Article 105, 122, which states that judiciary shouldn't be looking into the proceedings of the parliament, and there are various limitations on the parliament side from looking into the activities of the judiciary. So you could mention some of those constitutional articles, but you could then say that right from the beginning of the right since the independence, this balance has been this balance has been attacked. Okay, so in the beginning it was about the redistribution, the requirement of the state to go for a socialistic pattern. The major thing is redistributing land from Zamindar. So the tussle was about redistributing land from Zamindars versus the Zamindars' fundamental rights, Zamindars FR, because you know, in the beginning, there was a fundamental right to property also. So the question of redistribution versus Zamindar's fundamental rights. So these were the first serious question that brought the judiciary and parliament into direct confrontation. So you can make a mention of this. So this was the constitutional mechanism to achieve this balance. But in reality, this is how this balance started being disturbed. So as a response to this, we have the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the 17th Amendment. So this had all put the judiciary and parliament in direct confrontation, but it never ended. So it extended to the Indira Gandhi regime, where the idea of 42nd Amendment, 44th Amendment. So you know the Indira Gandhi directly said that, okay, to some of the questions, the parliament would have absolute questions over amending power, and the judiciary can't say anything about it, which was immediately rendered as unconstitutional, saying that judicial review is part of the basic structure. So all these tussles, you can make a brief mention of them. Then you could say that, so that is the up till Keshavananda Bharati, okay, sorry, 1973. you need to mention that up till Keshavananda Bharati, this tussle was going on. So it was a like you call equal battle between two equal powers. But since Keshavananda Bharati, this balance started tilting in favor of the judiciary. Okay, so you could say that with the emergence of basic structure doctrine, this balance started tilting in favor of the judiciary. So, the absolute power of the parliament to amend the constitution has been usurped by a judicially innovated doctrine of basic structure. In the Keshavananda Bharati case, this enhanced the power of judicial review in this country. And immediately after that, in somewhere around 1980s, you have the Maneka Gandhi case, where the Supreme Court brought in the idea of American concept of due process of law into Indian constitutional interpretation. So instead of the procedure established by law that we have here, they brought in due process of law in the case of Article 21. Okay, so that is a further weakening of or further shifting of from the system of parliamentary sovereignty to the judicial supremacy. So we are shifting slowly from the British system to more to the American system. So these two examples are ample evidence of that, which you can mention. Then you could even if you have examples, you could cite many instances where the proceedings of the parliament has been looked into by judiciary. The powers, privileges and immunities of members of the parliament has been interfered by the judiciary. So these were all the beginning of a huge imbalance occurring in the parliament versus judiciary relationship. So now you have to go to mentioning the implications of this imbalance. So far we saw how that relation got strained, how that imbalance set in, and you mentioned something about it. Then you move to the implications, right? Implications or the consequences of that imbalance. So first thing would be something what you could call as the tyranny of the unelected. So this is a very popular phrase, so I would suggest you to write that. So what do you mean by this? So here you have an elected legislature undermined by an unelected, undemocratic or non-democratic, unaccountable judiciary. So that is something we call as the tyranny of the unelected. So, so our last finance minister Arun Jaitley has made a comment. He says that he said that Indian democracy cannot be a tyranny of the unelected, and if elected are undermined, the democracy itself would be in danger. So this was his response to the Supreme Court declaring the NJAC bill as unconstitutional, NJAC Act as unconstitutional. So this is the most serious implication when the balance between parliament and the judiciary tilt in favor of the judiciary. So I think you could go with that phrase itself. Then the second point would be, so as a connection to that, you could say how an elected legislature is undermined by a judiciary and things like that. Then second thing would be strengthening of judicial review. Okay. So strengthening of judicial review after Maneka Gandhi case. So that is a light point. You could then say judiciary becoming more bold and venturing into judicial lawmaking. Judicial lawmaking and judicial policy making, both you could say, which you call as judicial overreach. See, actually the task of judiciary is only to interpret the constitution, but rights in the days of public interest litigation and the proactive the days of proactive judiciary by Justice Bhagavati and V.R. Krishna here, the judiciary started taking an active role in the interest of weaker sections. But starting with the weaker section, they started gradually venturing into the real domains of legislature and executive, which we call as judicial lawmaking or we call as judicial overreach. So the results or the examples you can cite in this scope would be judiciary declaring what you call the banning of liquor stores on the highway lanes, then the making compulsory what you call the light, the headlight of the bikes and cars in across the country. So these are not stuff which judiciary have any clue about. They don't know how to deal with this kind of stuff. But judiciary going into all those things are a bad thing for the Indian democracy. Then another point is judicial independence being made an end in itself. So due to this imbalance, the boldness which judiciary acquired due to this imbalance, they tried to make judicial independence an end in itself, and they use that to prevent constitution from adapting to the changing circumstances. The example would be declaring NJSC as unconstitutional. It's a very important critique of judiciary, so this has to be there in your answer. So declaring a bill, declaring an act which has been sufficiently passed by the Indian Parliament and almost half of the states as unconstitutional, just because judiciary didn't want that mechanism, it's a blatant disregard to democratic fundamentals, right? So that is another thing. So judicial independence. So how did they achieve all these things? They brought in the idea of judicial independence was always there, but they made it an end in itself. But whereas in the actual case, judicial independence is only a means, right? But they made it an end in itself, and they used to prevent it to amend the constitution, or they prevent it to what you call prevented the constitution from evolving to the changing circumstances. So that is another thing. Then another thing is that when judiciary frequently undermines the legislature eventually loses its legitimacy in the public eye. Okay, so overall we know that. So if we asked a normal layman, so he would say among the three organs, the legislature, executive, or judiciary, which is the one that he or she has the most trust in, they would immediately say the judiciary, right? So overall there is a trust deficit on legislature and executive, and that is being further worsened by this judiciary frequently undermining the legislature and the executive. So overall it doesn't augur well for a democratic system. So undermining the legitimacy of parliament and executive is another thing which has resulted from this imbalance. Then another thing is that judiciary doesn't preach what they practice. Okay, so we would think that, okay, so fine, democracy, we don't want so much of democracy. Let us allow judiciary to maybe ride roughshod over parliament and executive, but at least we would have a better government in this country, or right, we would have some institution which would look into the welfare of the people, right? So that is our expectation when we give so much space for judiciary to venture into the legislature and executive space. But actually that is not true. See, the judiciary itself has so much of weaknesses within itself. They have so much of pendency of cases. There are so many instances of corruption. There are instances of what you call uncle judge syndrome, where the uncle would be a judge and the nephew or niece would be an advocate arguing before them. So all these uncle judge syndrome things are there. So there is so much of corruption and what you call moral turpitude on the side of judiciary also. But judiciary hasn't done anything serious to address them. One example would be their constant refusal to pass the Judicial Standards and Accountability Bill, which was an attempt to bring some more moral strictures on the judiciary. That is one side that is kept in abeyance. Then the issue of judiciary being brought under RTA, that has been resisted for so long, but I think recently they have agreed to that. But it's still not clear whether that would really happen in place. See, so that is the overall implication. So the judiciary doesn't preach what they practice. So when we look into, they don't practice what they preach. So it's the other way around. Okay. Don't practice what they preach. Sorry for that mess up. Okay, so the judiciary don't practice that what they preach. So I think I have given some examples in all these scenarios. So these are the implications when this balance is shifted. So I think we have to give some solution to resolve this balance, right? So first thing would be there has to be a better relationship between judiciary and the legislature, and we should tilt in favor of the previously existing balance, or we should be giving more prominence to the parliament, because ultimately we are a parliamentary democratic system. So that is one that is one idea you have to bring in the concluding remarks. Then another thing is that the one major reason why judiciary has taken up so much space of legislature and executive is due to the inherent weaknesses of legislature and executive themselves. So there has to be serious efforts to enhance the quality of the parliamentarians, enhance the quality of debates that happens in the parliament, and the parliamentarians has to be in a real touch with the public sentiments and the needs of the public. So that is something they should be doing. Then the media and the civil society, just like they are so passionate to extract accountability from the legislature and executive, they should show that same passion to extract accountability from the judiciary also. So judiciary is no, what do you call, it's not something which can't be criticized, right? So even though there are constitutional limitations to which you can criticize judiciary, you could still point out the decadence and corruption that has crept into the institution. Particularly in point is the meeting by the judges coming out in the open, the arguments against the previous Ranjan Gogoi, the previous Chief Justice. So all these are real issues within judiciary. So we have to regain the balance. For that, like I said, the quality of the parliament and executive has to improve, but at the same time there has to be an effort to bring in the judicial standards and accountability bill and bring judiciary actively under RTI. Okay, so there has to be some more moral standards to what you call limit the functioning of judiciary in this country. So I think overall we don't want, in conclusion you can say that we don't want a tyranny of the unelected in a democracy, but we don't want the tyranny of the elected too. So that is the ideal scenario in which you should be concluding. We want both of these things to be resolved finally, so as to have a state that looks after the welfare of its citizens. Okay, that's all I guess. Thank you.